everybody. So I think this is going to be the third installment of, we're calling it Bagtober. I might have mentioned it in the other videos, but just the whole month, all bag patterns. This week we're doing a pattern that is a very fun, small crossbody. It can be as simple as you want. So you've seen me make this style bag before, but I did it with piping, I did it with binding, all sorts of fancy stuff. So we have the pattern here. You can make this as fancy or as simple as you want. And in this video, we're going to show you how to make basically a bare bones version. It still looks really nice, but it takes like a third the time of doing piping by hand, binding by hand, etc. If you want to do piping and binding, I'll leave links in the description to our video tutorials about that, because this looks really good with some binding. It looks really good with some piping. You can line it. This is lined in a nice green that matches the camo. But for this, I am back in love with one single leather, and you guys know when that happens I use it for everything. We are still using the tortoise leather from Newbury Leathers. It's just like the best chrome tanned. It's like kind of it's a pull-up leather. It's chrome tanned, but it's very firm still. This is actually, we have our gauge. It's 6 ounces. So we're going to be doing some skiving, but we're using one 6-ounce hide for this whole bag. I have all the pieces cut out. The pattern's going to include, there is a pattern, it's under 10 bucks. I have here, it's marked with a center line. It's also marked on the front panel. If you want to use a tuck lock, here's your square, so you would punch in each corner to set your tuck lock, which is, we have a tuck lock video too. This piece has 4 prongs that go inside of it. This piece obviously you just screw on the back, so you just need the center line for it. But I'm going to try something new. This is a marine closure. It's called a locks fitting. It's basically you pull this, and it's like a press stud. So one part goes in the base, one part goes in the flap. So all we need is the center lines for this. And I'm going to install it after because I don't know where it needs to go because I haven't ever installed one of these on a bag like this. So let's get into it. So these are our 3 main body pieces. We have our flap and our back. We have our front, which is going to be a little bit smaller. And then optionally, I also included a back pocket that is the same size. So if you want to have like a little pocket to slip a phone in or whatever, you can. The first thing we need to do though, you'll see on our main body piece, we have these little tabs. These are for our D-rings because we are eventually going to be making, probably not in this video, you guys know how good I am with making crossbody straps, but we're going to make an attachment for a crossbody strap. So I'm using 1/2-inch D-rings. So we're going to make some 1/2-inch straps real quick, and then we're also going to try out a little sample of a new material that Buckle Guy sent me that we've been developing since we started working with them. It's a no stretch fabric, kind of like the Velodon that we use, but it's thinner. So you have more options as far as if you want to use just one layer to add a little future-proofedness to the leather, it won't stretch, or you can stack it, use a bunch of layers and use it as like an actual stiffener as well. So these are 1/2-inch straps. I'm just going to rivet these on, but first we're going to apply the new sticky stuff and paint the edges. So here's the top secret. I don't think it's top secret. I don't know if I'm supposed to be showing it to you, but I'm sure they won't be that mad. So this is similar to the Velodon. The main difference is that it's a little bit thinner. So if you're using it just for its non-stretch properties, you don't need to worry as much about it stiffening or thickening your piece. But if you want to use it for a stiffener, you can just do 2 layers, which I really like because the Velodon's great, don't get me wrong, I use it for a lot of things, but we only need 1 strip of it. Sometimes it adds a little too much stiffness to places that don't need to be stiff, they just need to be reinforced. So what I'm going to do is I have, and all these measurements will be in the pattern. It's a lot of just leather strips, and I'm not going to, there's no reason for me to put an 18-inch by 2-inch strip. You guys can cut that out on your own. You're good like that. So I'm using 3-inch tabs here. I'm just going to cut a few, kind of eyeball it. These have a sticky back. Alright, so I can tell you, this stuff is pretty nice, but I think it needs a little work. And a lot of people won't show you the process of making a new material, but I think it's important because it's not just like you think of a new thing and you go source it. You got to try samples and work with it like this, put it into some sample projects, get it used for a while, And that's how you develop a really good piece, right? So like, for example, these knives. We haven't meant to be teasing you for 2 years, but it's really hard to develop a grip that's threaded that's solid brass. This splits a little bit. So we're back in the re-engineering stage for our final time. And eventually these will be out, but I don't want you to think that we're not... I want you to see the whole process, right? Because it's not failures, you know? If you get a piece and you're like, oh, the first version didn't work, that's not a failure. You're learning. It's all valuable information. You didn't fail. You learned what doesn't work, which is a way that you cross things off to lists to find what does work. So far, this is good. It is a little bit... There's like a sticky layer, then a more solid layer, then a pulp-based layer on top of it, and the pulp-based layer peels off a little too easy. So I think we're going to have to go and adjust that a little bit. But so far, it is more... There's some bumps in the fold because I didn't fold it... I didn't stick it while it was folded because I wanted to see how flexible it was. There are fewer bumps, and it's a little bit lighter weight, so it shouldn't be an issue. We're just going to use this as our guinea pig to test it. Stretch-wise, though, there is no stretch, so it's going to definitely do its job there. But yeah, just a fun little insight. I mean, I know it's boring, it's just a couple pieces of sticky tape, but you really do have to develop this stuff over time if you want it to be something that people make a bag out of, and then that bag is used for 50 years and it holds up. So that was a little, you know, part of working with Buckle Guy is we get to design, and we get to design a lot of our own stuff, as you guys know, with our stitching chisel line that's coming out. But we also get to help them with stuff that we're both kind of collaborating on as far as new materials spring to the market, which is really fun, and we feel very fortunate to have that job. So these squares represent roughly where you want your D-rings. Now you can do 3/4 inch, you can do 1/2 inch, you have a lot of different options. I didn't want to really box you into one specific thing, so all I'm going to do is I have my 2 tabs. I'm going to just put little rivets in here, and I'm going to line up my D-ring itself with the top of this box, center it, and just trace little circles where the holes land. And that way we have 2 custom little marks that we can then punch out in our pattern. And we will transfer over to our leather itself. And we want to install this first before we do anything else because it's going to be kind of hard to access after. Now, if you choose to use the back pocket, the reason that this line exists and this area exists is because this is the back pocket. So you can see this comes over and covers a little bit of this. And that does 2 things. First thing is it just covers it, makes it look nicer. The other thing is this kind of pops up the back pocket. So you automatically, it's already a little bit broken in, and you can get a phone in there because this will be a little tight in the beginning. It has to break in no matter what leather you use. I didn't want to do it so it pops out. Like, we could have sized it like this so you could immediately get in, but then it would lay against your body weird because it's on the back of the bag. This is the front panel to our bag. It looks very similar to the back pocket, except it's a little bit smaller. That's how you can tell the difference. So on the front panel of our bag, I'm going to take my dividers, set to about 3/8 of an inch, and I'm going to carve a line around the back side. This line is what I'm going to use as my guide to do my skiving, and we should have a nice little bell skiver looking skive when we're done. Next, our instructions call for, I obviously didn't put this in the pattern because it's just 2 strips, but you need a gusset strip and a double seam strip. These both need to be about 18 inches long. We're going to trim some off. On the gusset strip, you can go as wide as you want. This is how deep the bag is going to be. I'm going with 2 1/4 inches because I want it to be low profile. I wouldn't suggest going under 2 inches, and I wouldn't really suggest going over about 3. It'll get a little too floppy or big, but you can, if you want to use thicker leather, go for it. On the big gusset side, I am going to skive both sides of this because these are going to make both of these seams way easier to put together and to sew and to flip inside out. Now, this is going to be the seam where you would put your piping. Since we're making the bare bones version, which is still very nice, it's just not as detailed, we are going to omit the piping. You guys have seen me do piping a few times, and like I said, the tutorial will be linked in the description. This is a great project to learn piping on because it's small, it's pretty, there aren't too many drastic corners, and you can kind of make a bunch of these with very little material. And when you're skiving, if you ever get this kind of thing where you're talking and not paying attention, so it looks kind of like wavy, you can just go in, if your knife's nice and sharp, and clean that up a little bit. And you're good to go. So because this is a chrome tan leather, and we're going to be gluing this grain to grain, we want to rough this up. I'm gonna use a ruler and just do like 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch. Because remember, whatever we do this for a seam here, our stitching line has to be inside of this so that our glue doesn't show through when we flip it inside out. So before we stick these together, I'm going to take my dividers and I'm going to go to the widest part of where I glued, and I'm going to set them to be just above that. So once we glue this and flip this inside out, we're not going to see any of that glue. We're going to basically be stitching past the glue line. So we're going to go through and we're going to glue all this together. And if you're using chrome tan leather, you might have to do 2 layers of glue, which is what we just learned. But after you do 2 layers of glue, so you do 1 layer, let it dry, add another layer. We're just going to go around and glue it all together. Now you'll see that my gusset is a little bit long. That's on purpose. We want to be able to get a nice clean cut. Once I get this stuck down, I'm going to go over and I'm going to hammer it. Now, before we sew, we need to do some trimming. And the easiest way that I do this, or I found to do this, is we just lay this flat. We know this is straight, so we're just going to nip off that piece right there. Lay it flat down like that. Nip that off. So you can see we have the inside of our bag now. We're going to take our calipers, which we set, so we know that our calipers are going to give us a stitch line that is further than our glue line. So we're not going to have any glue showing through. And now we just punch and sew. So we're going to go through and we're going to sew this, but it's almost quitting time. So I'm going to sew this tonight. What you're going to want to do is we're going to sew around here, then we're going to take our 3/4 inch strip, and we're going to do the same thing on the opposite side. We're going to sew this on the inside, again, grain to grain, not flesh to flesh, so that are on the inside. Now, you might be thinking, well, why don't we just do this first? Because I found in this design a very important part of this is to lay this flat and trim it. It makes everything perfect without measuring, without anything. So while it is a little bit more of a pain to glue this in once this is all sewn in, it really ends up with a much better final product where everything is even to each other. Not necessarily, when you're making bags, especially when you're buying a pattern from someone else to make a bag, you could be using different thickness, a different type of material, a type of leather that folds differently or flips differently. This is the best possible way, regardless of the material you're using, to make sure that the bag that you make is going to sit nice and even and feel really nice. So we're going to sew around this, and then I am going to, off camera, glue this strip in. This is going to be our double seam for the back once we flip it inside out, and I'll show you that tomorrow when we're done. So back the next day, we have our seam sewn, and then what I did was I went ahead and I glued and stitched our little gusset here. So now we have to do the flip. All we're going to do is flip this like this, and this is where using the chrome tan is nice, because chrome tan really likes to flip. So it's fairly easy to get it to flip. It's not that hard, plus it's a half flip. Now we get to start to see our bag kind of coming to light. So this is going to be the front of our bag. Now let me get this one. Now you can see here, this is a good opportunity to show what piping, one of the reasons people use piping. You can see on this piece where we just did a seam inside, flipped inside out, it's fine, but you can see some of the threads, and this is tensioned correctly. What the piping does, it adds some rigidity, but it also hides this. So if you want to do piping, again, link in the description for our piping video. This is a great seam to learn how to do piping because it's nice and short. But it looks fine just as is as well. So our next step, we need to install on our back and flap, we need to install our D-rings. It's finally time to do that. So we made these in the beginning. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use my template, which remember, This pattern has a lot of flexibility built into it. So this is where you want your attachments to be, but you can do rivets, you can do stitching, you can do whatever you want. So I just left the squares, and then you can put whatever, you can do them on the sides. You don't even have to do them on the back. I'm going to do them on the back. I made these little D-rings. They're 1/2-inch D-rings. This is, we're going to fit 2 little rivets here. So I'm just going to place them using the template, because we want to install these before we sew everything together. I'm using single cap rivets on this, just because they're kind of they're what I have that's small enough and long enough to fit. And it's also kind of nice to have the flat back on the inside doesn't get caught on anything. So we're just going to put all these in and pop them down, and then I'll just go over to the press and install them really quickly. Okay, so once we have these installed, now is the time to, if you want, you don't have to install this, but we're going to install the back pocket. So I've made a back pocket. I've skived it super duper thin, probably almost too thin, but I think we can make it work. And what I'm doing is I'm using my grid to line up exactly where I want it. I want it covering one of these rivets and one staying above it. So you can make this as tall or as short as you want. If you want it like down here for a little tiny pocket, you can do that and just trim the excess off. There's plenty of room in the pattern for that. You can put it kind of wherever you want up to here. You don't want it obviously going over the fold. So I'm going to mark off the line here, and then I'm going to rough this leather up and get it ready for stitching. Now we're ready to mate the inside and the outside together, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the center line here to mark my center. Now there isn't a line for the sides here where it should match up, because depending on the thickness of the leather that you use, depending on if you use binding, if you use anything like that, it's going to be a little bit different. So I don't want to lock you into thinking that things need to line up exactly on a line, only for yours to be a little bit off, because that's okay. All leathers stretch different. You're going to use different thicknesses depending on how you skive. All we need is that center line. On this side, you can draw the center line on this piece. It is in the pattern here. However, we are not really using the center of this piece. We need the center of this piece. So what I do is I take my ruler and I go down and around like this. And this tells me we're right at 14 3/4. So I think that's 7 3/8. So I'm going to go start here, down 7 3/8, right there. And I'm going to make a mark there and a mark there. So now I have my center here and my center here. We're going to glue everything up. Well, actually, no. First, we're going to use some clips, and we're going to figure out where to mark everything to. So we're going to need to, this is our double seam. So we sewed this. This is going to sew in like this. Nice and easy, gives a lot of dimension, makes it a very comfortable bag to both make and use. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to match up my center line and my center line here, like that. And I'm going to clip that there. Then I'm going to work around, and I'm not going to do any, don't do any pulling. We don't want to be pulling this seam and kind of molding this leather out of shape. If anything, you want to push a little bit. If you're like, this isn't matching up, it's because you're pulling too hard. So if you push just a little bit, you'll get that right where you want it, and we'll clip it all together. Now remember, there's no glue here. We're just doing kind of a dry fit to make sure that our bag is going to look exactly how we want it. So you don't need that many clips because this is a fairly small bag. And we're not gluing it, we're just doing this dry fit to make sure that everything's lined up the way we want it to before we take the big step of putting it all together. Okay, now there's two things that we want to do once we get this clipped. We want to make sure our sides are even. How are we going to do that? We're We're going to put it down on our gridded mat. We're going to make sure that this side is following one of these lines. And then I'm going to slide this seam up to a horizontal and make sure that this seam matches, which it does. So now I can go in and make just the tiniest little mark here and here. So I know when I go to glue, I want these sides to come up. The next thing we can do is we can just look at it. This is our bag. This is how it's going to kind of look, right? We fold this down. We have our D-rings here. We have our pocket in the back. It's going to be a nice little bag. I am not installing the snap yet. If you're installing a tuck lock, install it first. Like I said, this is the first time I've ever installed one of these. I want to get the whole bag put together to figure out like where this needs to go. And then I'll just do what I need to do to punch a hole and hammer it in and all, or screw it in, I think, and all that stuff. So we're going to do that last. That's a one special thing that's happening for this specific bag only. You're going to usually want to install your closures before you put the whole bag together. So what I like to do first, before I glue, I always use about 6-ounce leather for this double seam here. I'm going to take, this is called a cobbler's anvil, so you have a small section and a bigger section. And these are nice because you can kind of shove, it's for a shoe, but you can use it for bag work and all that stuff. They're usually like 20 bucks at swap meets. If you see one, that's what it is. It was for cobblers. What I'm going to do is, you can do this on any, you can do this on granite or whatever you have laying around. I'm just going to slightly tap this seam here so that my seam kind of spreads out. It's just going to make it easier for me. I'm not going to be fighting that leather when I'm trying to get it to glue down. And we're basically just trying to hit in the middle here. You don't have to go crazy with it, just a little bit. And I'm not hitting hard. You don't want to like dent anything or split the seam wide open so you can see all the threads and stuff. Now that we've done that, you can see this lays nice and flat without me really even touching it. Now we're ready to glue. So to start gluing this up, we are going to use some clips, but we're only using them because it's a hard shape to hold. You guys know I'm not a big fan of clips. I think you should use a glue that sticks properly. But with this, it's just such a weird shape that I'm only going to lightly press this to make sure everything lines up. So I have my center line here, my center line here. I'm going to start in the middle, and I'm going to match those up as best I can. Then we have a flat bottom here, so we're going to make sure that is glued up as best we can. And we're just going to put a couple of clips here. I am pressing this glue down, but I just don't want anything to kind of pop off while we're in the middle of getting our sides done. So I'm going to then, I'm not going to do this curve yet, I'm then going to go to the top, and I'm going to line that up next. Now, usually, if you use the back pocket, these will line up. But, again, you could be a millimeter or two off. That's okay. It just all depends on all the thicknesses of everything involved in this. And for everyone, it's going to be different. Now, most of the time, I have this part glued down. So I'm going to put a clip there. Sometimes you might want to put two because there's a lot of tension on this seam as we're taking this corner. Usually, though, you can kind of do this flip, and it'll all line up pretty good. You remember, you can put your hand inside the bag and push out as well to get this lining up. There we go. And we're just going to do more clips. Doesn't have to be totally perfect. We're going to take this to the sander afterwards. And we're going to do the exact same thing on this side. I'm going to line that up with our mark. You can see how this side is a little bit off. I'm going to stick down this flat part first. Get our clips on there, and then it's an easy flip. Massage that into place there, and just get that down, and then we're just going to do a check, right? We're going to go on our cutting mat, make sure everything is nice and even, which it is. Smush this all down, fold this over, make sure that's how we want it to look. And now we can take our clips off. This is still a little bit delicate because remember we haven't hammered this down yet. Now, to hammer it down, you can use the side of a table, you can use the side of a granite block. I'm going to go back to my cobbler's anvil. These are super, super useful for this because it's almost like the welt of a shoe, I think. There we go. So, yet again, it's quitting time. So, Killian's going to head out. All we have to do now is just sew around this seam, and all of our sewing for this bag is done. So we'll come back to you tomorrow morning, we'll finish the edges, we'll install the closure, and this bag is done. I sewed around this whole thing, got it nice and burnished, little black dye. I'm just still loving this tortoise leather. With the black and the yellow, it's such a classic look. But we have one last step. We're going to be using these locks fasteners. So these are marine fasteners. They're not, some people use them for leather. I've never used them for leather, but they look really like a very good option. So we're going to give them a go. So what I did was, I took my pattern and I marked where I wanted this is the top cap. And the way this works is, you basically pull up. So this is the base. It's like a button stud. And you pull up and it releases. So I marked where I wanted this to go just a little bit from the edge. We have a centered line there. So we're just going to punch a hole. This is a 7/16 punch. I'm going to come up here. We're going to punch that there. The installation is easy. I will say, I'm pretty sure there's a tool that you can get to install this that I do not have. But all we're going to do is just screw one half onto the other. And these have like little, I don't know if the camera picks it up, but they have like little spikes. They stick right down into the leather. And I'm going to get that hand tight. And now this is where the tool comes in that I don't have, but you can just use a pair of dividers to just tighten that up like that. And as you tighten it, it pulls those spikes down into the leather. So that's on there nice and sturdy. Now we need to do our bottom half. So what I'm going to do is, since we're kind of going off the cuff here, I'm going to kind of mark roughly where I want it, which is going to be about there. Since these are super wide, it gives us a little leeway to make a rough mark, and then I can go in with my ruler and just make sure that's centered up, and that's actually exactly on the center. Now, since we've already made this, we can't just go punching directly in this, so I'm going to get a piece of, I'm going to stack some scrap here. Sometimes we do this. Obviously, this is the first time using this, but I would punch and install this beforehand once I know that this is going to work. So I just have 3 pieces of leather here, scrap leather. Going to stack those under there. Single, there we go. And you can see, you can use these multiple times, and it helps if you are trying some stuff out and you don't necessarily know that you want to use a piece or whatever. So then we're going to pop that in. Like that. And then screw this in, and on this the spikes are on the back. So I'm just going to hand tighten that as much as I can. There we go. And then I don't want to scratch the leather, so I just want to be careful and tighten this down. There we go. Now, since this is a pull-up leather, if you get little scuffs here, you can just rub it out usually, or you can use a heat gun, and then it'll go away. But we should be done. I've never used one of these before. Let's see how it works. There we go. That's cool. Then undo it. And here we go. So here's our final piece. We have our nice pocket on the back. This is a nice simple bag. It's really easy to make with the double seam. You don't have to be gluing and clamping and all that stuff, and it lays really nice. Now remember, with this design, you can go super fancy. If you want to do some edge binding, if you want to do rolled edges, if you want to do piping, you want to do different types of closures, you're going to have all that in the pattern. You have your center line to mark wherever you want. You have where a good place to put a tuck lock is. Obviously it goes on the bottom here, but then you can utilize that center line to do different sorts of closures like this. I had to put some stuff in it because this is a little bit of a vintagey feeling leather, so it doesn't have a lot of body when it's empty. And then on the back, you have your general marks to put whatever sort of D-rings you want. You could also put them on the side. So we really tried to just, like all of our pattern, we just tried to make it as customizable as possible. It's a nice base for you. But regarding the one that we did make, I've obviously never used this, but the locks closure is really cool. It's super easy. It's super easy access. It's solid brass. It's marine grade, so it's rated for saltwater exposure. Obviously, it's a little weird to get used to on just a little bag like this because there's not much in it. But this back holds a cell phone. Well, Kaylina just got a new cell phone. It's really big, so we have to. This fits a cell phone that is 6.5 inches wide. Some cell phones are the size of small iPads now. But inside, you can fit a much bigger cell phone. I just have little bags in here right now to fill it out so I can use the locks fitting. That's going to be it. So thank you guys so much for watching. This is week 3 of Bagtober, as we're calling it, and next week will be the finale. We got a really good one that Kaylina designed for you. We'll see you in the next one.